This is an RNZ podcast.
They say it takes a village to raise a child. I'm Catherine Ryan, and here we draw on my conversations with experts on 9 to Noon to help you navigate family life. Nathan Wallis, even teenagers do, don't they? They certainly need someone to love. Not necessarily going to tell you that, though.
Yeah, thought that was a good lead-in.
Parents of teenagers often wonder what has happened to their child's brain. They may be moody, not understanding or appearing to care about consequences. They may struggle to maintain focus and may be very self-absorbed. Neuroscience educator and parenting expert Nathan Wallis says during adolescence, parts of the teenage brain are, quote, shut for renovations. He says understanding the changes that are taking place for the adolescent will help parents successfully navigate these important and formative years. Kia ora and welcome back, Nathan.
Kia ora, Catherine.
Let's do the basics. Let's go back to what happens and when with the brain beginning, as you say, to go through such a transition that bits just shut down. What age is it hitting?
Well, I mean, in the literature, it can start as early as 9 because things like body mass and even, ethnicity come into it. Māori tend to hit adolescence earlier than Europeans, and Pacific Islands tends to hit it even earlier than Māori. Like I say, the larger you are, the taller you are, the earlier you hit it. But it tends to be around that 13, 14 age. But pretty much, if you're living with the teenager, you know it's happened. Yeah.
You see, that's interesting because there's the physiological changes. And look, it is a real challenge, actually. You might want to comment on it. That children are going through, and they're children, you're 9, you're a child, going through puberty younger and younger. So the body's changing. But is the brain keeping in pace?
Well, they are connected, so and in lots of ways you could say it is keeping pace, but it's still, a very short childhood and a lot of adult pressure at a very young age.
So, parents may be dealing with this stuff younger and younger and younger. That's just, it's been a consistent trend, hasn't it?
That's right. But, I mean, the good news is that it comes back way flasher after it's gone through this shut for renovations period. It gets a lot of renovations done in that time, and it is normal. So, everyone's going through it. I always think don't judge who your kid's going to be as an adult by looking at them in the middle of adolescence, because being an adult's all about having a frontal cortex, so you don't look when it's shut for renovations and judge them. Who they were at like 11 typically is much more who they're going to be as an adult.
What is the part of the brain that is going through this revolution? What sort of behaviours is it typically, or actions is it responsible for?
It's the very flash, clever part of our brain, the really human part, the frontal cortex, that does all of our higher functions like empathy for other people. So we think of teenagers as being me, me, me. It controls your emotions, so rates of suicide, depression, anxiety all skyrocket during adolescence because their ability to control emotions shuts for renovations. It's really that ability to regulate their behaviour and regulate their emotions, focus their attention. All of that's up there in the frontal cortex, brain number 4. And that just gets shut for renovations for 3 years to get all of this rewiring done, if you like, all this neurological pruning and, lots of stuff goes on. If it stayed open for business and the teenager kept, focusing their attention and controlling their emotions and remembering their PE gear, that amount of renovations would take 30 years. So instead it's just shut for 3 years and they get the whole lot done in a shorter space of time.
If only Kiwi Build could match, right?
Yeah.
So, it makes sense. It's a heck of a lot of change. So what is the teenager typically experiencing? Are they often... I mean, the self-absorption is interesting. Adolescent egocentrism is a term I remember from years back.
Right, yep.
It makes sense. I've got to concentrate on me because so much is going on. And does that mean... It doesn't mean that you're necessarily being selfish. It's that you simply often won't see or think about stuff that you will when you're older.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not an absolute thing. I mean, it doesn't 100% shut down. All language is in the frontal cortex. So if it's shut completely, then every teenager will lose the power of speech. And they don't. I mean, even if you've got a teenage son and you think that's happened, he still says, no, don't know. So it's unfair to say the whole thing shuts down, but it's shut for renovations, say 90% of the time. 10% of the time your kid is an adult. 10% of the time they're just as good at controlling their emotions as you are and seeing things, because that frontal cortex is shut 90% of the time, not all the time.
So that 10% matters. That's your moment to seize.
It is, really, because whichever part of the brain you sort of talk to, you're feeding and nurturing. So that's the part you really want to feed and nurture. When that 10% turns up and suddenly your teenager seems like they've got their frontal cortex online and they're being all reasonable and considerate, then you really want to prioritise that and stop what you're doing and feed that part of the brain, have the conversation, because that's what's going to make adolescence be over quicker, is that. And the opposite, you don't want to so much get into all the fighting with teenagers and thinking you've got to win every battle. And, when you're arguing with a teenager, you're essentially moving down into your own limbic system, so now, your own emotional brain. So now you've got two 15-year-olds, so that's not, every good interaction involves at least one cortex. So since theirs is sort of shut for renovations, you want to try and make sure that yours stays online and not get into those fights.
So when you feel that red rag, feel the blood pressure go up, you feel that surge, what is it? Just deep breath, just pause. You need to say something sometimes, don't you? And what are some of the strategies for diffusing? You can do it with a bit of humour, although sometimes that makes someone even more rabid. But, do you need to make a holding statement sometimes and then just leave it be?
Yeah, exactly that, I think. I'm just thinking that a bit of a hypocrite, really, because I'm not that good at it myself, My 16-year-old would roll her eyes at me, and that would really trigger me, and then often it's out of your mouth before you've thought about it. So the strategies are just to learn to shut up, really. For me it was. Like you say a holding statement and turn around and walk away. That's not the time to have a conversation when you've triggered your own, emotional system. But it does get easier.
It's hilarious, the eye roll, isn't it? It's like, or that thing, like every single thing you say, like this can go on for a whole day.
Yeah.
Everything you say is stupid or this or that. And I mean, they are the classic symbols, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's trying to avoid those. And when they are using their frontal cortex and they're talking, you don't get to choose what they're talking about. Every generation of teenagers wants to like things that their parents don't. My grandmother didn't approve of Elvis Presley, my mother didn't approve of video games, like it's just what they do. So if they want to talk about Kim Kardashian and Kanye West, you might just have to suck it up and have that conversation. If that's the only time they're going to use strategic thinking and planning and empathy for others, don't worry about what they're talking about, just as long as they're using those functions, it's all good.
That's important, because the temptation will be to say, I've got a 5-minute window where there's engagement going on here. I'm going to bring up all my stuff. But actually, there will be a time when you need to bring up some stuff. You need a time when you bring up some stuff. But actually just staying in their zone and just having a moment of connection on their terms,
makes
important.
a huge difference, that connection. And it's remembering that if 90% of the time they're in their emotional brain, then you really need to speak to those emotions, and connection's really important. If you just go to problem solving all the time, and just, as soon as they issue a problem or talk about a situation, you go straight into trying to fix it, it feels to the teenager like they haven't been listened to, because you've gone straight to your frontal cortex, which is about problem solving, whereas 90% of their worldview is about emotion and the limbic system. So if you don't speak directly to that emotion, they really feel like they're not listened to. And if you've got kids that feel like they're not listened to, they're probably not going to listen to you. Kids do as you do.
Seizing your moment for something big you want to raise, though, again, if there is something that really needs to be discussed, is it going to be one of these times? And okay, you're happy to talk about Kardashians today because you don't need to talk about anything else, but when you need to say, we've got to talk about what happened on Saturday, or we've got to set some rules for what's going to happen on Saturday, again, are you scheduling, are you seizing a moment for that, or what?
No, I think it's better for those sorts of things to give them warning.
To be planned,
Yeah, if it's predictable, that really calms the human stress response system. Anything that's sort of sprung on you or is novel information arouses that, and that's exactly the opposite to what we want to do with a teenager.
Straight into defence mode.
So and choose a time, because your teenager. I know my kids were most reasonable in that after-school period, between sort of 4 and 5. So if that's when it wasn't a guarantee, but
had they been
that
fed?
was the most likely. Yeah, well, that's me. They got home from school, they had something to eat, they had the whole evening in front of them, and it just seemed to be a happier time for them. So if I was going to talk to them about something, I'd tell them, when you come home from school tomorrow, when you've had something to eat, let's sit at the kitchen table because I want to talk to you about da-da-da.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And then they can stew on that if they want. They can certainly strategise, but they're not being surprised.
That's
and also
right.
They're not feeling like a moment they're having with you has been hijacked for a purpose.
Yeah. And then it's about how you interact once you're there. Because if you just go straight into lecture mode, then it's just nagging and they tend to switch off. So it is, again, that validating their emotions, Before you say any strategy, you should reflect back what their emotion was behind it. Oh, that sounds like it made you angry, or that sounded like it made you happy. It's not complicated, but by doing that first and you've spoken to their emotion, that calms that part of their brain. And then you've got way more access to the part of the brain that you want, that part that is, got strategy and empathy for others and controlling emotion and all the good stuff.
So it's remembering all the time. 99% of their brain at this time is feelings.
Yeah, that's right. It is. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Now, the emotional regulation stuff, it's still required in certain circumstances. You don't get a free pass. So again, how do you approach the fact? We will need. I can remember it. I mean, I can remember doing it. Like some demon just took over your head and you just screamed. And certainly, all parents have experienced being on the other end of it. How are you dealing with these outbursts? And does it get to a point where they are particularly problematic? They're not just to be ignored. You know, when are you really in trouble with some of this emotional regulation stuff and or some of what follows it?
Yeah, I think you're really in trouble when the child has actually crossed a line and is hurting somebody else. You know, if they're actually just having a meltdown, then there's no need for a consequence or something for that. That's just them being overwhelmed by emotions. I would still do that thing where you reflect back their emotion immediately to them so that they feel listened to. But really you want to defuse the situation. They're having an emotional, outburst. That's not the time you're going to access their frontal cortex and do problem solving and stuff. So I would just focus on calming them down and then come back and revisit it. Just like we talked about before, about we need to have a talk about how you do this, because you want to teach them some strategies other than bursting into tears and collapsing on the floor. They've got
so how do we do that? Because say this is affecting schooling, or say it's affecting relationships, and it can become a vicious cycle where your behaviour pushes people away, and then you behave worse. So how can you have some of those conversations? And again, when they are responding to very profound feelings, you want to talk logically, but that's not necessarily what's going to register, or can it register in the right circumstances?
Well, it can register, I think, if you do the validation first. It's like, number one, calm down the brainstem. Just, make them a sandwich or give them 5 minutes, but number one, calm them down. Number two, validate their emotions. Reflect back what emotion they're feeling so they feel listened to. And then number three, you can go into problem solving. It's not nagging then, because you've done steps 1 and 2. But if you just go straight to number 3, that just sounds like nagging and they switch off. I think in that situation, you've got to actively teach the child some strategies for how they're going to calm down before they lose it. And that's so getting them at a time when they're calm and saying, well, here's some strategies. I mean, there's a thing in the literature that comes across quite strong called 6-4-6, which is breathing in on the count of 6 and breathing out on the count of 4 and breathing in on the count of 6 and out on the count of 4. If you do that for 2 minutes, it calms your whole HPA axis. That's the highway of stress in your body, the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal glands. And it activates the vagus nerve. But that breathing, 6-4-6, for 2 minutes will completely calm all of that. But when someone's stressed out, getting them to stop and do controlled breathing is, not the easiest thing in the world. Sometimes it's about looking at the big picture with those kids, and if they're having emotional outbursts, what's their lifestyle like? Are they eating lots of sugar? We know the 4 things that really reduce your brain's ability to cope is caffeine, alcohol, tobacco, and sugar. So look at how much of those are in their diet. Look at things like exercise. Teenagers that aren't moving, it's not natural for human beings not to move and to be sedentary. So you've got your brain's sort of reliant on all those hormones and stuff, and a lot of that comes just from movement. You don't have to run a marathon. The literature actually talks about this thing called the letterbox effect, where just walking to the letterbox to check the mail and walking back releases enough endorphins into your brain to change your perspective. So I think if you've got a teenager that's acting out like that, then you can control a lot of those things. Just simply make them walk home from school instead of picking them up. There you go. There was 20 minutes exercise.
You'll get a screaming match for it, but it'll be worth it at the other end.
Yeah.
What's the difference between boys and girls in this stage of development?
The gender is playing a role, and they act out in different ways because they have different surges of different hormones. Boys are getting pumped up with testosterone and girls are getting pumped up with estrogen, and they bring about different behaviours, but it still means that they deviate from their normal behaviour. They kind of go back to the way they behaved at 2, where it's still their temperament behind it, but their behaviour is much less considerate of others and stuff.
We've talked a lot about the outbursts and the over-verbalising of feelings. What about the reverse, when you're getting silent treatment? Or when it's not even the silent treatment, which is another form of, I'm punishing you.
Yeah.
It's more, you feel like you're not, there's just no communication here.
Yeah, there's just no connecting. Yep. Yeah, I mean, that can be normal, that they shut down a bit. It's not so much important that they have to talk to you, just that they have to talk to someone. And we often say in trauma and counselling fields that just getting it outside of your head, you're 90% of the way there. It's the kids, and the majority of people that are going to have problems with anxiety and depression are people that kept it inside their head. Because just the process of saying it out loud makes you have to put into what they call a coherent life story. It has to be coherent to say it out loud. Whereas in your head, it can all be swimming around and seem coherent to you, but when you say it all out loud, it's incoherent. And that's often at the base of most, mental unwellness. So just getting it out of your head is the number one thing. So any way that parents can find to do that, and if it's working, do it. It doesn't have to be the parents. They've got a favourite auntie, their grandparents. As long as they are talking to someone, then that's the main thing.
What do you do with siblings who are as confused by this sudden kind of monstrous change and maybe on the receiving end of a bit of it? How do you talk to them?
Yeah, that's interesting. I've got those memories of my, younger kids looking at their older teenager and going, oh my God, I'm never going to do that. And then, 2 years later, they're doing exactly the same thing. So with my younger kids, I think I would just, again, validate it. I would just say, yeah, well, she's feeling very emotional at the time, and she's, I'll try and say something positive. Yeah. She's getting better and better at learning to regulate that, but yeah, it's a hard time, adolescence.
Yeah. And how long can be the range? Some whiz through and some still going in their 40s.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there is a huge variance like that. Whether it's a firstborn girl, she's probably done it quite early and has an adult brain by 18. If it's a boy who's not the firstborn, he doesn't really have an adult brain to 32, so he can still be acting quite like an adolescent at 26, 27. But it's not just, your gender. There's so many other factors that come into it. But, you often don't have an adult brain until you're 32. And if you're doing drugs and alcohol and dealing with addiction, then you can actually, like you say, it can go right into your 40s, 50s. I mean, the brain's always trying to grow. So even the people, trying to drown out and kill their frontal cortex with drugs and alcohol, it's still trying to grow in the background. You still see progress.
Okay, just a couple of quickies if you would. My nearly 18-year-old, always a lovely, popular, confident kid, has been lonely and searching for new friends, but has gone all shy, insecure, unconfident and privately unhappy in recent months. Had a hardcore group of mates, but he's a year younger and has drifted from his mates since summer because they're into drinking, drugs, cars and have girlfriends, etc. Just started uni, looking forward to new start and people, but it's a lot of work and no socialising so far. I'm worried for him. Should I be, or write it off to teen angst? I don't want to miss any warning signs.
Oh, that's a really good question. I think lots of parents face that same situation too. I'm tending on the side where the child's in a whole new situation, so I think it's fairly normal. It's like that thing where kids are most creative once they get bored. He's probably going to really brush up on all his social skills now and actively work out ways of meeting other people and starting new relationships because he's in the situation where he has to. I think as long as she remains in contact with him and validates that stuff and says that, it's normal that way, and then when he feels listened to, she can offer strategies for him for how he can get out and meet people, in a meaningful way. Because there's lots of ways that young people can meet other people. There's lots of apps for it now as well.
Listening again. And just finally, we touched on this earlier, what happens if schooling is affected by the lack of focus? 16-year-old boy. NCEA doesn't make allowances for 3 years of shutdown.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. We only found out the brain shut down about 15 years ago. We invented, exams 100 years ago. So that doesn't match up very well.
Okay, thank you for the observation. There's a couple more come in, but unfortunately they've just landed right at the end. We'll save them for next time. Thank you very much. Nathan Wallis.